All right, welcome back. Today we're going to be diving into another pitch deck. This time we're looking at Uber. Their first funding round, they raised $200,000 when they got into Techstars, one of the leading accelerator programs for startups. This was back in 2009, and we're going to be diving into the pitch deck. This is 25 pages, so it's a little bit longer than some of the decks we see today. I'm going to be breaking down what they were pitching, what they were prioritizing at the time, and give a little history lesson along the way. If you want your deck to be submitted or you want to do a consultation with me one-on-one to talk about this stuff, to dive in, maybe be featured on the YouTube channel, click on that first link below to schedule some time to talk. I'm available to anybody, and leave a comment below on a company that you want to see me track down their first pitch deck and talk about in the future. So with that, let's dive right into it. All right, so let's dive into the deck that raised them $200,000 from Techstars Ventures, one of the largest accelerators for tech companies in Silicon Valley and one of the first back in the day. This is 2008, 2009 setting, so having the iPhone 3G on the left side and the BlackBerry on the right side seemed futuristic at the time. And as you can see, and you're going to see throughout the deck, this is a luxury car service, I guess because at the time it was hard to imagine the average person participating in this. So they go with the next generation car service as their slogan. And they kick it off right away by really diving into the taxi cab and medallion system. If you're unfamiliar, basically you'd have to hail down the taxi cab that was just driving down the street, hopefully catch someone's attention, get in the car, and go. This was obviously a pretty annoying system. You couldn't get it on demand and didn't know who the driver was. Oftentimes the taxi drivers might drive you around in circles to try to rack up the fees, and then it was a cash-based system for quite a long time, and as even in 2008, that was pretty inconvenient. So they talk about many of those things. There's not a lot of technology. It's really manual in this process. And then there's the medallion system, which was great for taxi cab drivers, but it didn't work very well for the end customer. It's kind of a monopoly style of system. We might call it an economic cartel. And so what are they trying to do? Look there at the bottom. Digital hail can now make street hail unnecessary. They went the Apple route of really key branding their technical solution with digital hail. It's capitalized. This is really what they wanted to try to go with, that digital hail system. So they got their problem. Now they go into the solution. Uber cab concept. It's fast, efficient. There's a market for it. There's professionals all across American cities that don't want to hail down taxis. They didn't quite understand or see that it was going to be for everyone, because you can see here at the bottom, it's the NetJets of car services. If you're unfamiliar with NetJets, that's a private jet leasing company or renting company to go from one place to another, kind of like Uber, but for private airplanes. So that puts into perspective the clientele they were trying to target. They dive into this even more throughout the rest of their deck. This is more of their technical solution of the fact that it's a one-click car service, which at the time was fascinating and groundbreaking in so many ways. The hailing concept from the street really being something that they're focusing on here, which I think goes into the emotional concept of pitching. When you're pitching an investor, you want them to really be emotionally tied to the problem and solution that you have. And this is a pretty big one for a lot of people from back in the day. This is a very confrontational situation, very inconvenient in a lot of ways. So they really wanted to focus on that. Guaranteed pickup, not hailed from the street, but it was a membership model originally, as you can see here, and that quickly changed. So let's talk about the key differentiators that they prioritized, members only being the first one. The one-click hailing, as we talked about, is a real clear problem. They wanted to continue to highlight, continue to emphasize, to really hammer that point home, because if you can demonstrate that it's a real problem and you have a real solution for it, that's a great way to establish market dominance. On top of that, we have the tech solution. We've got great drivers and luxury automobiles. They really wanted this luxury feel that I think certainly established the brand positioning for the business. Even as they expanded into larger markets, they still kept this priority premium feel across the Uber Lux, across the SUVs that they have, the black cars. They always wanted to prioritize that high luxury clientele, even when they prioritized other cheaper solutions on top of it to grow. Then they go into their operating principles, their mission, their core values, luxury service being first. Then they talk about all the other benefits here. Specifically, I want to highlight The statistically optimized response time. This is a pretty forward-thinking and novel concept they wanted to prioritize, and they definitely stuck to their guns here as Uber became very famous for using artificial intelligence and machine learning to optimize routes, to optimize drivers, to gamify the experience for both sides of the equation, to build a stickier, more efficient system. But there's one funny one here, and that's profitable by design. Obviously what investors want to hear. However, in practice, it definitely was not as easy for Uber, as they ended up raising 32 funding rounds and $25 billion raised. And I don't even know if they're profitable today, almost 15 years later. So interesting stuff that was a priority for them. They just couldn't quite get there. But we see that a lot with pitch decks where you're really trying to pitch the vision. Sometimes you don't always get there. That doesn't mean that it wasn't profitable for the investors. So they wanted to focus on the app. This was a pretty big deal, especially as we said, it's 2008, 2009. The iPhone had just come out. A lot of people were still on the earlier generation cell phones and technology that did not have very much apps. I think you were even paying for internet access in most cases on a lot of these devices. So having an app alone was a pretty big deal. But it's funny that they also had this SMS solution where you could text maybe a phone number and it would schedule a car for you. That very quickly went to the wayside when the App Store really took off across the world. Ubercab.com, they've got here booking trips. You got to specify the locations, Google Maps integrations. This is a website. In order to do this, you could potentially log the different locations that you wanted to go to. And really, this is just, again, bulking out the solution that they've already built. This is presumably a pitch deck for Techstars, so they're maybe trying to get a little bit more technical in explaining their solution than you might for the traditional investor deck. I think that this is a slide, for example, you might not need in a really general investor deck because you've already talked quite a bit about your solution. You also need to go into the rest of the pitch. Use cases. This is fascinating because they were in a industry vertical that not many people were familiar yet, and it was a industry that was very traditional and antiquated. They kind of had to justify why the market would even be interested in a product like this. So they tried to give some use cases, elderly, kids, working while commuting with Wi-Fi in the cars, which was a pretty big deal back in the day, especially as cellular was still very expensive. Airports, which still now today is huge, a great example of them understanding their target market even well before the product was live at scale like it is today. To and from restaurants, bars, and shows is another great example. Bars, preventing drunk driving. This is a huge one. They put it first in their bullet point. I think that they hit the nail on the head with this one. And then parking. Again, another perfect example of where Uber fit into the economy. User benefits. This one is pretty straightforward. It's self-explanatory. Again, I think this goes back to really defining the market, helping investors understand why the end customer would want to use this. I don't think I need to explain to you why Uber is useful, but cab systems were really inefficient. I think this was highlighting that and really getting that emotional attachment to the actual solution that they've produced because there was a lot of animosity against the cab and taxi system, even for the average person. And so the final bullet here is pretty interesting. Uber cab would be faster and cheaper than a limo, but nicer and safer than a taxi cab. So they were trying to fit in that limo light experience, and that certainly fits the luxury examples that they've pitched throughout the entire deck so far. Diving into the environmental benefits, this is interesting as well that they include this as a slide. They were trying to get cars off the road, right? So they wanted to prioritize that, car sharing or carpooling rather, and ride sharing, all of those things, as well as all of the other pieces with respect to them using hybrid vehicles as opposed to traditional cars. I think that this model really didn't hold firm at scale because they needed so many cars in so many cities. They didn't prioritize necessarily hybrid vehicles as opposed to just the traditional car. But I think everything else still rings very true today. The Uber cab fleet. Originally, their goal was to have their own fleet that they would control. They had premium, standard, and existing town car fleets. So they really wanted to hammer home some of these environmental concerns and where they were focused on creating a better system for global transport, or at least certainly US-based transport with vehicles. Their initial service area, they launched in San Francisco, they piloted there, and then they went right to Manhattan. Makes total sense. The two largest districts of taxi cabs in America. It makes total sense, especially New York City. Fascinating to see how it caught on from there. Technology, this goes back to their solution, goes back to what they're trying to build. I think this is pretty high tech for the time. Obviously today it's a little bit different, but they were already on to the intelligent scheduling. They were already onto the application route, which was something that was still very early. They were focusing on route optimization. Look, they've got different graphs that are trying to prioritize different metrics that they're looking into. I think a lot of this is pretty high-tech machine learning and regression analysis, even for the time. And so that's really fascinating that they had a patent pending system design. Something you don't necessarily see in the average tech company these days is a focus on patents on the technical solutions that you've built. This is a great way to build a moat against other competitors, or potentially a revenue opportunity to license it out to larger corporate partners or even cross-industry partners. So really cool to see that this is included in the deck and included as a priority and focus for them as they move forward. Finally, they've got more focus on statistics. This is demand forecasting. So they're trying to prioritize where the demand is going to be coming from so that they can get those cars there quicker. They can reduce their costs and idle times of the vehicles. Again, a lot of focus on the analytics. This is what people don't necessarily realize when you look at Uber. There's so much analytics that goes into prioritizing and routing these cars appropriately, making sure the drivers are in the right hotspots to be able to get to the customers as soon as possible. And a lot of this is probably the reason why they were able to raise successfully, because they had a focus on not only a solution that solves a problem, but justifying why they're the right team and why their solution is the right one. And this is something that is really important to hammer home for founders. Not only do you need to have a good solution to a problem, but you need to justify why is your solution the right one? Why is your team the right group to get it done? And with co-founder Garrett Camp founding StumbleUpon, he probably had a lot of experience with different internet models, with different analysis and analytics with respect to sorting and having algorithms to predict and model the behaviors and interests of users. So then you could apply that very well to this. And then, of course, Kalanick's cutthroat and aggressive scaling was super valuable for the company as well. Then they go into their actual market slide of trying to quantify the market. Here you've got some numbers that 4.2 annually and growing. The top 4 players make up 22%. This is medallions and limousines. This is presumably where they talk about inefficiencies in that model. The composition here is a focus on what people are actually using the rides for. So retail, business, airport trips being the priorities for them here. And it looks like that makes a lot of sense and helps understand and showcase where their priorities are at and what they're going to be focusing on. Their target cities, this is their scale and expansion play. I think that this is important to note. A lot of times founders are just looking to raise money just to raise money. And hey, we're looking to raise $1 million. Why? Well, because I think I need $1 million. No, that's wrong. That's not going to be very helpful. That's not the answer an investor's looking for. Instead, you're going to be able to say, well, because we want to expand to New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Philadelphia. That's why we want to raise money. That's why we're trying to scale aggressively, because we think we can get into a lot of different cities. And look, if you just take those first 5 cities, it covers 50% of the US market. So we need to get there as fast as possible. So that's why we're raising money today, is to be able to prove this solution out, to build revenue, to raise additional capital, and to scale into many different cities. This is kind of an interesting slide here. We don't see this quite as much as in today's market as opposed to then, but they actually outline a best realistic and worst case scenario for the investment in the deal. And this is really cool. So the best case scenario is that they become a market leader and $1 billion in yearly revenue. And so I think that obviously this is a great scenario and like you'd love to see it. Well, they made $32 billion in revenue in just the last year. So actually, this was just a pretty good case scenario, as they've 30 times the revenue that even in their best case scenario, they would be able to hit. So a pretty realistic outcome, all things considered. But they've got a realistic success scenario where, look, we just get some percentage of market share in US cities, and we're going to be able to profit from it. Now, this is probably a little bit optimistic solely because, look, in their best case scenario, they're talking about revenue. In the second scenario, they're talking about profit. So I think that if I was an investor, I would certainly be interested in seeing what their margins are or what they expect their margins to be able to calculate the best case scenario, what the profits are. Because really, for a company like Uber, they struggle to make profits. I don't even know if they're profitable today. So to assume you're going to make profit in the realistic case scenario, obviously assumes you're profit in the best case scenario. So I would want to see the conversion there from revenue to profit to better estimate what those predictions actually look like. But again, this is just a slide in the deck from 15 years ago. And then finally, worst case scenario was that they become a private service for driving cars and they own a bunch of vehicles and they can network with executives. And that was kind of their worst case scenario, was to be a car driving company. And if that's the worst case scenario, they're rubbing shoulders with the right people. Then they actually have a slide on smartphones. So this is how you know how early they were to the game, is they actually had to justify why people would use an app. And so really, really cool to see that in this slide deck, because it almost feels like a look back into the trends of the market. Obviously today, you might need a graph to show why people are using computers because everyone's using mobile. I certainly know from my experience running businesses, most of our traffic has historically come from mobile these days, even from an internet browser like using Safari on the iPhone. But back then, it was justifying why people were even using apps. And so look, iPhone representing 10% of smartphone requests back in 2008. I would guess that number is much higher today. Future optimizations, this is kind of their roadmap, what they want to do next. They want to get used cars. They want to use hybrid vehicles that are less expensive, have more accurate GPS technology, which is kind of interesting because today our GPS technology is pretty good. Discounted rates for having multi-hour bookings, all these types of things. This is kind of interesting because for such a technical and forward-thinking deck, this slide actually feels very short-term to me. Like cheaper cars by buying used, I feel like that doesn't drastically change the economics at scale. So I think that if I were an investor, I would want to see, cheaper cars by buying at scale, right? Where you could say, look, if we buy 100 cars, if we buy 1,000 cars, we're going to be able to get cheaper prices, as opposed to cheaper cars by buying used, right? Less expensive hybrid vehicles is the same thing. A hybrid vehicle maybe saves you 10, 15, 20% on each vehicle, but that's not an incredible savings to really optimize the growth engines here. So I thought this was a pretty interesting slide because it's very micro, it's very detail oriented. Perhaps the pitch had a different narrative that they were going with here. Or maybe this is just because it's an accelerator and they were trying to show more of that boots on the ground style of understanding of their business model and where they can cut on the margins, maybe to make profitability or something like that, as opposed to being at a cash loss. But I thought that was pretty interesting about this slide, is that it's actually pretty low risk and low, I think, vision in respect to the rest of the deck. They've got some marketing ideas here. Again, this is where we start to lose a little bit of the focus. Yellow Cab is the only recognized brand. That's why they went with Uber Cab as their position. So they really wanted to be this premium cab service. They really were still trying to synonymize themselves with cabs, presumably because people don't necessarily attach to totally foreign ideas. So they wanted to keep something that was familiar but different enough to provide a better solution. They even tried to capture the invite-only model. We see this in all different industries now, this exclusivity style of thing, making it hype. They had some possible slogans, the NetJets of limos, Cabs 2.0. They were really trying to think of the future of the cab, the taxi cab industry, as opposed to the future of transportation. And so I think that that's a fascinating thing to look at, where their position in the industry was in 2008, 2009, and it was very humble from their beginnings, as opposed to today, where people don't even think about taxis anymore. Unless maybe you're really deep into one of these urban centers, you're probably not seeing very many taxis unless you're at the airport. Finally, they had some other index slides here. This one is a location-based service. This is really a lot of the same types of things that they were talking about in some of the earlier slides in the deck. And then our final slide is where they're at today. So you can see where they're at today. They've got a website, they've got the SMS code, they've got trademarks and LLC set up, but that's pretty much it. They've got a bank account and some clients, but they did not have a lot of details on the business yet. So perhaps that's why their earlier slides were a little bit more focused on what they can do operationally. But this is how early in the game, their goal was to raise a couple million, have a small office, and then go to market in San Francisco. So that is the full pitch deck for Uber. I think that this whole deck, it's a little bit long. If you were to have a pitch deck for your company, you're probably going to want to keep it in that 10 to 12 slide range as opposed to 25. But again, this was for an accelerator. Perhaps they were trying to be in more detail to really demonstrate the market need and their opportunity. And I want to be mindful, certainly this is a US focused pitch deck. Other countries, other jurisdictions have very different standards and can be much more text heavy, can be much more interested in research and studying in order to prove the market validation for the solution that you've built, especially for a pre-product company like what Uber's done here. But anyway you slice it, they did an amazing job in building a huge company out of such a cool idea. They really wanted to focus on the emotional attachment and narrative behind how people hated taxi cabs and hated that process. And they wanted to create the more luxury solution to save time, to make it a better experience, and to be the NetJets of transportation with taxi cabs. So with that, click the link in the description if you want to check out this pitch deck or schedule a consultation call with me to talk about your business, to talk about what's going on in the professional world, and I'll talk to you next time.